Greetings from, I'm Daniel Golden, the proprietor of Boswell Book Company. It is day 4,128 of us being in business, most of which we were a physical bookstore, but lately a little virtual. To the Boswell website, where we are selling copies of The Lives of Edie Pritchard. The book is currently 20% off and will be for at least the next week. And in addition, as you can see, all our copies are signed by Mr. Watson. We are so honored to be hosting Larry Watson, who, while no longer living in Milwaukee, is still considered a Southeast Wisconsinite, despite really only setting one book here. I was told that once he moves away, so I'm not sure if Kenosha's far enough. This is his 11th book, and it is also winning rave reviews, including from several Boswell booksellers. This is our 4th event at Boswell, and my 5th overall, because I believe I hosted him once in the Schwartz Bookshop in Mequon. So when I believe you were at Stevens Point. And this is so cool because Larry's going to be in conversation with Mitch Teich, who is the longtime executive producer of Lake Effect, who is now at North Country Public Radio. And this is his very first time back doing a program in Milwaukee. And let me just say there are a lot of conversation partners out there, but Mitch, you're my favorite. So one of my favorite authors, one of my favorite conversation partners. I can't imagine a better event. We are so honored to have both of you. Let's give them a big hand of however one does that. So thank you both.
Let me just say, Larry Watson, what a delight to get a chance to chat with you. Welcome to my dining room in Potsdam, New York.
Thank you very much.
When we were kind of chatting a little bit before this event actually began, Daniel suggested that we get the conversation underway by kind of having you give us a nutshell description of what readers can expect from this book. So imagining that the two of us are 6 feet apart in an elevator someplace, how do you describe the lives of Edie Pritchard?
How many floors?
Well, I could go back to my time in the Chase Tower and say we've got 7 floors to go to.
Oh man, okay, that's tight. I think of the Lives of Edie Pritchard as the story of an extraordinary, ordinary woman, and somebody who is known for her good looks, but as it often happens, sometimes looks blind people to qualities that are every bit as rare and often more important. She's intelligent, she's courageous, she's hardworking, but she has trouble, mostly because of the men in her life, being seen who she is. And the novel has 3 parts. Oh, gee, we're getting down to the ground floor. And each of those 3 parts, they're at 20-year intervals. It begins in 1967 and ends in 2007. Each of those parts features a road trip. And during each of those road trips, Edie Pritchard is able to demonstrate those remarkable qualities.
Which of the 3 Edies came to you first? The 24-year-old, the 44-year-old, or the 64-year-old Edie?
It was the first Edie, the 1967 Edie. In fact, true confession here, that first section I thought would be the novel. But as it turned out, I got to the end of it, and not only was it not, it couldn't stand on its own, but I just felt there was a whole lot more Edie.
Well, and I think one of the remarkable things about even the 24-year-old Edie, but really the Edies that we meet at every step of the way, so much of those are informed by who Edie was before we even met her. the Edie of high school.
And that's part of the part of her difficulty in being known for who she is, because as those of you who come from smallish towns know, that who you were in high school is likely to follow you throughout your life. And she happens to be in that first section and in the last section, living in the town where she was born, raised, and went to high school. And sometimes people know her according to who she was in high school, and their memories aren't even accurate, but that doesn't dislodge that identity.
Right. There are a number of scenes in this book where people who knew Edie in high school are recalling scenes that they thought they remembered featuring Edie. There's a scene where somebody thinks they went skinny dipping with her, and she's insistent that that actually wasn't her, or she wasn't skinny dipping.
Exactly. But by the time she relates that story, she has long since given up trying to correct the record.
How did you set out to understand who Edie was?
Oh, wow. Sentence by sentence. Yeah, really. I originally thought this book would be, and my working title was Edie and the Linderman twins. I thought those three characters would share the stage, and I thought it would be primarily a story about the Linderman brothers, twins, both of them in love with Edie Pritchard. And as I wrote, Edie just came to the fore. I mean, it just seemed to me as though she had more in the way of depth, complexity, and so I just kept following her to see what she revealed.
Which do you have a sense for which of the three Edies was the hardest to get to know, or the hardest for you to conjure?
Oh, could have been the middle Edie, the middle Edie as she was coming to be known. That Edie is the Edie who has left her hometown, and at least in the first pages of that second section, she is married to another man and seems to be settled into a life.
I don't know that we are giving anything away or giving too much away to say that the men in Edie's life are not all that kind to her. Do you ever step back and say, wow, I wonder if I'm piling on a little?
No, we've earned it. Come on. We deserve all we get.
You mentioned the Lindermans. Edie in the first sentence, or the first section of the book rather, is Edie Linderman because she is married to Dean, the twin brother of Roy Linderman. And while the specter of Dean exists in each section of the book, and Dean exists as maybe a concept throughout it, Roy really exists in the flesh in each section. And there are times in which I feel like Roy is both Edie's nemesis and also her ideal. Can you talk a little bit more about the complexity of Roy?
Sure. Roy is in all three sections. So we see Roy age just as we see Edie age, and I think we see some change in him, and it seems silly to say this about a man in his 60s, but we come to see some maturity as well. And he loves Edie. I think he loves her in all three sections. In the first section, lust dominates that love, but I think he loves her as well. And but throughout, he wants to be with her, and he wants to take her away, and that sort of intrigued me. I'm not quite sure what's at bottom. I think it might be that Roy senses too that Edie might need to leave that town, Gladstone, Montana, her hometown, and his hometown.
Roy wants to be loved. Edie wants to be loved. In fact, it's a recurrent theme among a number of the characters in this book, including Edie's granddaughter. The idea that people want to be loved, but I guess it seems like they don't necessarily think that the people who they want to love them understand what that means.
Yeah, I almost, you know, I haven't sung in public since the second grade, but I almost burst into song there and sang that they're looking for love in all the wrong places. And they're looking for love from the wrong people too. Edie's granddaughter has had an unfortunate relationship with her own mother. And she has found something, or so she thinks, in the company of, once again, two brothers. And they're just trouble from the word go. And, Edie sees that her granddaughter does not.
Do you think Edie sees herself in her granddaughter?
I don't think she sees an actual resemblance in terms of character, but I think she sees what can happen when your identity begins to come from others, and especially when those others are like the Billy and Jesse, those brothers.
I mean, that really reminded me, this may be the most unlikely comparison I could imagine, but I was reading the book about the musical Hamilton by Jeremy McCarter not long ago, and it went into great detail about the significance in that musical of the question of who gets to tell the story of history. And I get the sense that this is a question that's driving Edie. Who gets to define her?
Yeah, I don't think she's terribly interested in having anybody tell her story. I think she simply wants to live her story. But of course, she sees that other people are sort of telling her story all the time. There's a scene fairly early in the book after Roy has had his automobile accident. She's talking to somebody, and that person thinks that, are you married to Roy? These are not identical twins, and yet there is still that confusion of identity. And so that's another way that her story is told by who she happens to be married to, or who people think she's married to.
I've been meaning to ask, is there a scene from this book that you would want to read and to give us a little flavor for Edie and how the book plays out?
Yes.
And would you like to set it up for us?
You know, I'm going to read a little something that is at the end of the very first section. I mentioned that there are a number of road trips in this, and so we see Edie on the road. She's left her husband and Roy. They have both gone off on some mission that they think they need to gain revenge and resurrect the family name or something. And Edie thinks it's nothing but nonsense, and she was afraid for her husband. But then at some point she sees that they're going to go off and do what they do no matter what she says. And so this section is at the very end of this passage that I'm going to read is at the very end of the first section. She's left Gladstone and she's left the twins behind. Edie has been on the bus less than an hour, and its easy bounce and sway are already transporting her toward sleep. Looping the strap around her wrist, she tucks her purse close to her side and away from the aisle, then closes her eyes. But in another moment, she's jarred back to consciousness. A large woman in a man's wool overcoat is lurching up the aisle toward the front of the bus. She's waving her arms and yelling, "Wait, stop, we have to stop." When she reaches the driver, she bends down to tell him something. Edie can't hear what the man says, but the driver extends an arm in an attempt to calm her and move her back toward her seat. His effort is in vain, however. She continues to hover near him and to plead her case. In another moment, the bus slows and the driver steers the vehicle to the side of the road. The vehicle leans, totters, and finally stops, half on the blacktop and half on the crumbling shoulder. The driver shuts off the engine and pulls on the emergency brake. He stands and turns to face the bus passengers. "Folks, we have a little situation. This lady has forgotten her medication in her luggage, and it's medication she says she needs. So we'll dig out her suitcase, get her pills, and we'll be on our way again. Feel free to step out and stretch your legs." Edie follows everyone else off the bus, but while they gather near the driver, as he opens the luggage compartment, she walks behind the bus and stands by herself on the cracked, frost-heaved blacktop. It might not seem like much, this country. A few bare hills, each seeming to rise out of the shadow of the one behind it. Miles of empty prairie, and all of it, hill and plain, the color of paper left out in the sun. You might be out here alone someday with what you thought would be your life, and a gust of wind might blow your heart open like a screen door and slam it just as fast.
I thought wow when I read that, and I think wow right now again.
I just made it up.
I got to wondering about both this idea of defining ourselves and about the sense of place that you conjure. How much do you feel at this stage of your career like you are conjuring Montana? And how much is Larry Watson's Montana, the Montana that we filter through you, the writer?
Yeah, it's this is the Montana of my imagination. And so it certainly bears resemblance to the actual Montana. And some of those places are in both my Montana and the real Montana. But yeah, it's, and sometimes I'm not even sure if I'm remembering or imagining. And to tell you the truth, I don't care that much. I noticed that somebody had a question for you about Glendive, wondering if Glendive figured in this novel. He must be protective of Montana. And the truth is that my Gladstone of this novel and of a previous novel, it pretty much is Glendive, in location anyway. But of course, if you call it Glendive and you write a novel about it, then people are going to write you, send you emails and say, no, the Dairy Queen is on the south side of town, and no, the river isn't, there isn't even a river there. So, and once you've gone to the trouble of imagining it, you might as well get some use out of it.
Well, and at this point, I mean, you've written about the fictional Gladstone before, but do you feel like there are any mysteries to these places for you? Do they reveal themselves to you in new ways with each book?
No, oh, yes, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Sure, I could spend a lifetime writing fiction set in one of those, in Bent Rock, for example, or in Gladstone. And it's just some sense of geographical fair play that tells me out of the state's borders and into North Dakota, briefly, for example.
Well, and you, of course, grew up in Rugby, North Dakota, if I'm not mistaken.
I was born there and I lived there until I was 5 years.
Oh, okay.
But it really centered me because, of course, as you know, it is the geographical center. of North America.
And because it's the geographical center of North America, it's really the geographical center of the universe, is it not?
I didn't want to make that claim, but since you did, yeah.
Do you get the sense for what draws so many people who might not have any connection to North Dakota or Eastern Montana or these places that you conjure up? What draws them to places like this in the times that you write about them?
I'm not sure if it's exactly this, but years ago, I was at a writers' conference in France. And it used to be that the French really had a love affair with Montana, and there was a sort of cultural exchange. Editors and writers would come to Montana for events and for fly fishing and hiking, and in turn, the French would often invite Montanans or faux Montanans to their conferences. And I was on a panel discussion one time with a number of real Montana writers. And at some point, one of the writers on the panel turned to the audience and she said, well, let me ask you, what is it? What's the French fascination for Montana? What is it about that place that fascinates you so? And there was a man in the front row and he mouthed the word and I was able to catch it, and it was space. And I think the space is a really big part of it, and I think it's I think it has some validity, but I also think it's a misbegotten notion that with all that space you can be whoever you want to be.
Social distancing at its purest.
Yes, long before anyone else was doing it in the Dakotas and Montana. We pretty much had social distancing down cold.
So much of your fiction is set in the past, and I feel silly saying it this way, but the relatively distant past at this point. How comfortable do you think Edie is in the Montana of 2007? And how comfortable were you writing her in this more recent era?
Took a little bit to readjust to having cell phones in my fiction. Yeah. I think Edie is a more, can I say it like this? I think she is a more vivid presence in 1967 than she is in 2007. But in 2007, she is content living a very quiet life. She's living alone, and maybe that's gives her more of a chance to be herself and define herself.
I want to ask you about how you have been getting through this difficult time. We mentioned social distancing, and the sense I get is that writers are already kind of socially distancing creatures. Has the pandemic been a gift to your writing, or has it been inhibiting?
I don't know if it's been either. Maybe I've gotten a little more work done. I've been retired since 2018, and so I became a bit more productive starting then. Our lives, my wife's life and mine, they're very similar to what they were before the pandemic. You know, here's our day. We read, we listen to music, we go for a walk around the harbor, we watch good television or a movie in the evening, and that's what our lives were before. That's what our lives are now, except, and you all know about this, except bouts of grief and rage, and sometimes they come on very unexpectedly.
This would normally have, I imagine, been a fairly celebratory time as you would be getting ready for the release of the film adaptation of Let Him Go, which I I gather is still due to come out later this year, but it must be a little tempered by the circumstances under which we're all dealing.
Yes, the movie was scheduled to be, the movie Let Him Go was scheduled to be released August 21st, and Focus Features has now moved it back to November 6th. And there's not a calendar over there. There's somebody who knows the answer to these questions. Sure. Yeah, but you know what? I've got a book coming out today. There's going to be a movie later on this year. What kind of a jerk would I be if I complained? Yeah, no, it's been wonderful.
Well, and I guess I'm curious how much you were exposed to the creative process through which that film came together. You know, I remember I remember talking with Richard Russo some time ago about what it was like for him to visit the set of Nobody's Fool, later the set of Empire Falls, and you know, I guess I'm curious what the writer thinks about when he knows that his vision is being channeled by somebody else.
Well, I thought of it pretty early on as the movie was an expression of someone else's vision. The director, who was also the screenwriter, he and I had some conversations pretty early in the process. We did visit the set. It's fascinating to see how movies are made. My wife and I have since seen the finished film, and we both thought it was wonderful. It's different from the book, but you know, it had to be. No, I was fine with everything about it, really everything.
And excited, I'm sure, to whenever it finally reaches the big screen, it will be an exciting time.
Yes, it will be. I might not be in the theater, but it's an exciting time.
We'll have to see if the drive-in theaters are still operating outdoors in the cold weather. I know we've gotten a number of questions already through the chat and through email, and I want to make sure that we have a nice crowd here. I think 68 people on this call, which is by far the largest crowd I've had on a Zoom call at Boswell of the one. But let me pull up the one that I have on my email already, and I'm going to see if I can do this. I think the multitasking is the first thing that goes. Here it is. This is a question from Marina, who asks, having read 3 or 4 of your books, I find them to be very gritty, just as I believe Montana is. How do you infuse that sense of grittiness into your books? Do you think it's word choice, character description, storyline, all of the above, or something else? Or I'll add, do you feel your books are gritty?
I think I'd say yes to that if I could be sure we were all sharing the same gritty definition of gritty. Yeah, I think characters, mostly from the characters who I think are often rough around the edges, and some of them, it's not just the edges that are rough, it goes right to the core of them. It comes from the place and from life that is for many people hard in that place. So I'll leave it with that, character and place. Those are, I start with those before I get very far with a plot.
I'm going to break the fourth wall here and ask Daniel Golden. We're soliciting questions through the chat at this point.
I know you have questions for Larry. I will say that CJ had a question for you, Mitch, which is that your famous blazer?
And I responded to him privately offline and pointed out that it is not Eddie Bauer, it is LL Bean, but it's pretty close. We have
yeah, go on.
It looks like we actually do have a question over chat. And this is from Dave, who asks, is your daughter Amy the basis for a character in any of your books? I guess he has several questions, so we'll stop with that. Is your daughter Amy the basis for a character in any of your books?
Yeah, yes. Yes. Do I have to name the character?
I was just going to say, always leave us wanting a little more.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's fair to say that there is a little bit of Amy in quite a few characters.
And he goes on to ask, for the movie version of Let Him Go, were you consulted in any way by the script writers, or do they have full control of the story, and do you get a screenwriting credit of any kind?
I do not get a screenwriting credit. As I said, I had conversations with the director, who was also the screenwriter, early on in the process, and he sent me a draft of the screenplay and said I was welcome to make comments, suggestions, and again, by that point, I felt it was his, and so I sort of bowed out. I think I had maybe one or two small things having to do with the time and the place, and maybe the transmission of an automobile or something. But no, I not much input from me at all.
It's interesting. We're having this conversation virtually in Wisconsin, and I can say this is probably the third or fourth time that the two of us have spoken about your books. I'm curious what people in Montana and North Dakota have said about them. What kind of feedback do you get from people who are in Glendive, Montana, or Williston, North Dakota, or those places?
I see that there is a Bismarcker here, so I'm going to say Bismarckers love it. Montana's been pretty good to me, pretty good. Montana 1948 was Community Reads in Missoula a number of years ago, and Let 'Em Go, I think, was a Montana Book of the Year. I've been out there for a number of writers' conferences and festivals. No, Montana and North Dakota have both been good to me. I haven't heard from Williston, but.
Well, and if the people who inhabit these books are not universally sympathetic, I do think that the place you conjure up is, if not romantic, certainly maybe sympathetic is the right place. It's delicious in a way to experience Montana through your eyes.
Ah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I don't think it's going to be used in any tourist brochures or anything like that, but I have tried to be fair to the state. I mostly write about eastern and central Montana, and that's not part of the state that generally makes the postcards and the picture calendars. I happen to think it's beautiful, but it does have the kind of beauty that you have to look for, and you need a certain kind of discerning eye to notice.
And along those lines, we just got a question from Andy, who writes, in the Lives of Edie Pritchard, you describe the Badlands as, quote, a country of compound fractures, in describing the rocks breaking through the landscape. And Andy is wondering if you intended to introduce an element of violence into describing the peaceful, beautiful landscape.
Yes, yes. And if you have been through the Badlands, whether they are the North Dakota, Montana, South Dakota, Canadian Badlands, I think it's I think it's inevitable that you see that as a violent and perhaps forbidding landscape in certain ways. Yeah, beautiful, but yeah.
We have a question from Petey, who asks, is entering the mind of a female character different for you than entering the mind of a male character?
Entering the mind of one character is different from entering the mind of another character. I mean, yeah, and before I do that, I don't think. Well, yeah, maybe I do. I guess I ask whether or not I feel as though I have access. If I know a way into this character's mind, and if I do, then I'm ready to go and willing to try.
Daniel, has anyone raised their hand metaphorically yet?
There is somebody.
Scoogs, we call him Scoog, Larry. Larry's brother-in-law, Bruce, has said, as he's reading Edie Pritchard, how can he get in the mind of a woman? And my answer to my husband, Bruce, who is Larry's brother-in-law, was to say, Susan, his wife. I'm probably wrong, Larry, but that's my guess.
No, no, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. Edie isn't Susan.
No, I don't.
Visual aid.
Edie has short hair, for example.
Well, I know. Doesn't look anything like Susan, but
and yet,
the wisdom.
I think I mentioned perhaps in my acknowledgments that she was sort of the template for Edie. If I could imagine that she would behave that way in a situation, then I felt, okay. Yeah. And a couple things she'd actually done.
Well, and the two of you are both from small towns in that part of the world, correct?
Yes, but we don't call them small towns in that part of the world. We call them cities.
But I guess I wonder if you imagine how people in the places where you grew up see you today, whether they still see you through the filter of the people that they knew when you were growing up, the way Edie sees herself reflected in the person that people thought she was.
That's a chilling thought, Mitch. Yeah, it might be true. It might be true. I don't go back often, and the friends that I have from that era with whom I'm still friends, we've sort of been friends through the years, so we see each other as we are now, not just as we were then. Yeah.
I wonder if Edie would be on Facebook.
I kind of doubt it. Yeah, I kind of doubt it. Yeah. By the time Facebook comes along, has a life that's pretty private, and I think she likes it that way just fine.
Trish has asked a question in the chat and is asking, if you do not live in Milwaukee now, where do you live?
Yes, I just saw that question pop up. I live in Kenosha. And
I don't know if Trish has a follow-up question to that, but But you enjoy your life in Kenosha, it sounds like.
We do. We do. Yeah, we live half a block from the lake, and Lake Michigan is just like, it's going to sound strange to say this, but it reminds me of when we lived in Salt Lake City and we lived near the mountains. But the mountains and Lake Michigan, like other natural phenomena, you see something different every single day. And we make it a point to look every single day.
That's great. I'm looking at the books on the shelf behind you, and I can't read the titles of any of them, but I'm curious what you've been reading during the pandemic, if there's been anything that's either served as comfort for you or escape, or just been a compelling read that you might want to recommend.
Oh, sure. I'll mention a couple of them. You know, I was a teacher for so many years. Teachers are rereaders, and so I've been rereading some books, and one that I read recently was E.L. Doctorow's Ragtime. And when that book was published, I was in Doctorow's class at the University of Utah. He was there for a visiting writing term, and I remember that book as a great read, and it holds up well. I thought it was wonderful. I read Daniel Mendelssohn's memoir, detective stories, Holocaust history, The Lost, and that was just tremendously moving. That's a couple books, yeah.
We have another couple of questions, or a question and a comment. Leslie Kagan, who has written a fair number of books herself, asks, have you found it easier to write a novel the longer you're at it, or is it harder?
You know, it's only easier in the sense that once you've done it, you know you can do it, and maybe that means nothing more than putting words on all of those pages. You know, I mean, it's that old Steve Martin joke. He wrote a novel and he said he's pretty proud of himself because all those pages were blank when he started it. So, but it doesn't get easy. You know, every novel is different. Every novel poses its own problems. Yeah.
And let's see, Sherry Hoffman would like to know, what are you working on now?
A novel. Yeah, got a novel in the works. Yeah. Yeah. Too early to say. I'm not sure if anything will come of it.
All right. I think, Daniel, you've passed along a couple of questions. Is that right?
Go ahead, Nick.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor to meet you virtually, Larry. I'm an English teacher in Racine, and for the past 5 years, I've had the pleasure of teaching Montana 1948 to my students. And so I'm wondering if there's anything specific from Montana or any of your books really that you specifically hope young people take away from your writing.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. It's, yeah, I'm flattered and honored that you'd be using my book in your classroom. You know, I hope that a book like Montana 1948, oh hell, it's not a book like Montana, but Montana 1948, I hope it gets students to talk about what it means to do the right thing. And, but I hope they talk about that with full knowledge of how difficult it can be sometimes to do the right thing. I'd be happy with that.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have a question from Sarah Wadsworth, who asks, Larry, could you talk a little about what it was like to write about age and aging in connection with a female protagonist, or thinking of As Good as Gone, a male protagonist? Did you think about aging differently in the course of writing those two novels?
Well, I was doing some firsthand research. Well, one of the things that I realized, I don't know if it was as I was writing or after I was writing, I realized that my aging characters, I think, were in many ways more vital, more vibrant than aging characters are often depicted in television and movies, for example. But I have to tell you that when the novel As Good as Gone came out, that a reviewer who was generally complimentary about the book said that there were, he put a warning into his review, and the warning was, warning contains elder sex. I didn't think warranted that, but yeah, there you go.
It's amazing they didn't create a sticker for that that went on the cover of the book. A question from Kim Soor, who asks, she wonders how you think books and publishing will change, or if they will change post-COVID. Perhaps they'll come with hand sanitizer.
There will be, yes. Spray this with Lysol before you open it. Yeah, I don't know. You know, people are going to continue to read. People want books. They want stories. I think this is a plea to readers and a prayer for Daniel and Boswell books. I hope we have great stores like that that survive this difficult time, because we need them. Not just as a place to buy books, but as a place for us to gather, and as a heart of bookstores are the heart of so many communities. And you know, I think there's a piece in the most recent New Yorker by Lawrence Wright, who wrote that really frightening horror tale about a fictional pandemic, but was eerily close to our times. But in this recent article, Lawrence Wright says, and he's in conversation with somebody else, that often on the other side of pandemics, there is a kind of cultural breakthrough, that something happens that leads people to think in new ways, and maybe that might be something that happens for us. I don't know.
We can only hope.
We can only hope.
Mitch, I have one of the hand people.
Oh, great!
People.
And I know there are a couple more questions on chat we want to get to, but yes, I'm happy to go to a virtual hand raiser.
One thing I should add about COVID is one thing we saw at least one large publisher eliminate all printed advanced copies and ask folks to do read-only ebooks. And after a few months, lo and behold, they started doing a select number of printed books again. We see the generation shift coming where my booksellers don't really, booksellers themselves don't care, but it's not, I'm in my late 50s, my booksellers in their 40s still only read books. I've noticed my booksellers in their 20s, they're like, well, whatever, however you give it to me. So for that said, so we have a little while. Arlene Hove, so I'm gonna unmute Arlene.
Hi, it's a pleasure to meet you, like someone before said, virtually. And I was wondering, the first novel of yours that I read was Montana 1948. What inspired you to place Bentrock, the town of Bentrock, 10 miles from the North Dakota border and 12 miles from Canada?
Well, I'm just making up this answer now because, of course, I can't remember. I wrote that a while ago, but that was a book that borders seemed important to me. border seemed important in that story. So I had a sheriff in there. Sheriffs have to observe borders and jurisdictions. There are ways that you cross borders and you cross into dangerous territory. You cross borders when you begin to behave in a way that is inappropriate, immoral, wicked. And so I thought if I tucked it up there in that corner, plus I could sort of partake of both North Dakota and Montana by having it there. Also, it seemed to me unclaimed territory. You know, writers are always looking for some place that they can make their own. And I thought, yeah, I don't think anyone's staked a claim here yet.
Well, thank you for that answer. Can I tell you quickly why I asked that question? I live very near to that. In fact, it's where my brother farms and ranches to this day, is 12 miles from Canada and 10 miles from the North Dakota border. So, and I live about 3 miles from him. So we're very, very in tune with what you say. And thank you for your answer.
Oh my God. If you would have said those things before I answered, I wouldn't have attempted an answer at all. Oh, that's very interesting. Thank you for that. Thank you.
Larry, if it makes you feel any better, I'm talking to you from about 15 miles from Canada, but much further from North Dakota. We have a number of questions from Delman, and they cover a variety of areas, and I apologize, I don't think we're going to get to all of them, but he writes about editing and says many novels and memoirs seem to lack a clear revisionist attitude, and I'm going to just jump forward. He says, to the point, do you have an editor? How much revision do you do when it comes to the finished product that the rest of us get to read? And I hope I've represented that fairly, Delman.
It really varies. It varies a lot. So for example, Montana 1948, there was very little I had to do to that novel. In fact, I've joked that I wrote that novel out by hand, and my printing is pretty legible, so maybe they could have just photocopied those pages and saved on printing costs. Other novels had to do a good deal more. My novel Laura, I think I cut 200 pages from the finished manuscript, working with an editor. You know, my hope is always that I don't have to revise. I'm not a very good reviser. I don't like that part of writing. I know it's necessary. But one of the reasons that I write so slowly is that my hope is that I'll get it right and I won't have to revise. And though I've come close, that's never happened. But my relationships with editors have been good, and I've had a number of different editors over the years. My wife is probably here totaling them up right now. I don't know.
You know, you mentioned early in the interview that the book was originally just going to be that first, 24-year-old Edie Pritchard. How close to, sort of a complete manuscript did you get with just that first portion of the book? And how quickly did you realize that it would have to be, for lack of a better term, a trilogy?
Mm-hmm. I think it was a conversation with my agent. I said it to him. He didn't say, this won't work, but it was sort of novella length. But I think during that conversation, I probably mentioned to him that I was still thinking about Edie. I thought there was more to it, more to her and to her story. And he said, why don't you just keep going?
I think we have Daniel, time for 2 more questions. You think that's fair? Okay. One is from Dave, who asks, do you ever experiment in a different style just for fun, not for publishing, like maybe a hard-boiled detective Raymond Chandler noir short story, for example?
Yes and no. I mean, I had a story in that recent anthology, Milwaukee Noir, and I felt as though I was able to catch something noirish in the style or in the character for that. Everything I write seems to me an experiment. I mean, it feels as though I'm doing something different in every book, but I think sometimes I'm the only one who knows what that experiment is.
Petey has asked, I can see that the idea of borders has metaphorical significance in Montana 1948. Would you say that there is a metaphor that underscores the ideas of the Lives of Edie Pritchard? Or do we need to find that out for ourselves?
Thanks for that, Mitch. You know, I think there's a little tension in that novel between motion and stasis. You know, I mean, the various road trips in the novel, and so that might be something. Yeah.
I guess I'll ask the question that that I had decided I wasn't going to ask. Names are always significant, and I guess I was wondering. Linderman is German for light man, and I wondered if there was anything significant to the last names of Dean and Roy, and for a time Edie.
Yes, but I'm not sure what it is. No, I think I got that name from. I think there was a well-known rodeo star, maybe 50s or 60s. I think he was a Linderman, and so I think that was stuck in there someplace and pulled it out.
I always wonder if most authors have a well they go to for character names, like they go through old box scores from the 70s or rodeo characters from their childhood or whatever.
There was a time when I found that I had an inordinate number of characters whose last names were the same as Sierra Club photographers, because I was just looking up at the calendar on the wall. Cemeteries are great source for names.
Yeah. Well, that seems like a good bizarre way to end this conversation. Larry Watson, it really has been a delight. Congratulations. It's a fantastic book. I know Daniel will probably talk again here in a moment and remind people that there's a link to signed copies of Larry's book, but I want to say thank you so much.
Well, thank you. You're welcome. Thank you so much, Mitch. It's just been wonderful to talk to you again.
And next time we'll do it all together and all sanitize our hands and put on masks at the end.
I just want to say that if you haven't bought your copy yet, I agree with one critic who said that Larry Watson is incapable of writing a one-dimensional character. You are just like, you bring these people to such vibrant life. The sense of place that you always have is terrific. And you really, the quiet suspense that you build in your stories. Like, I don't know if I would say Larry Watson's a thriller writer, but your books have so many of your books have this really, they satisfy the urge that we get when we read suspense novels. So I can't recommend it enough.
I just wanted to say that with this book, this is my second book from Algonquin. I have a new publicist this time, but I made the same request that I made with As Good As Gone. I don't care what I do in terms of book tour and events. I just want the launch to be at the world's best bookstore, Boswell. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Larry. We're so thrilled to be that you're a part of our lives. Larry, continued success. Hope everybody gets a copy. Thank you to Larry Watson. Thank you to Mitch. And thanks to all of you, because we wouldn't have a virtual bookstore without you, and hope to see you at another event. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks so much.